Welcome to The Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm Maz, and I speak to soldiers, academics, refugees, peacemakers, and anyone else who's been touched by war in the hope of demystifying and, most importantly, de-glorifying it. If you like what you hear, please consider showing your support by reviewing the show wherever you get your pods. You can also support us on our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Mike Martin and retired Lieutenant General Arne Dalhaug. Both of these gentlemen have been on the podcast a number of times before, so I won't be providing lengthy introductions. I will share links in the show notes to previous episodes where you can find out more about their individual careers and achievements. But in a nutshell, both Mike and Arne have been regular commentators on the Russian invasion of Ukraine in both regular and social media. Mike is a former British Army officer who subsequently completed his PhD studying war and conflict. He has published a number of books, including An Intimate War, still one of the go-to books on understanding Afghanistan, as well as Why We Fight, a book that explores root causes of human conflict and war. Arne is a retired three-star general who was previously the Deputy Chief of Norwegian Armed Forces, served as the Norwegian Military Representative to the NATO Military Committee, and was the Commandant of the NATO Defense College. After retiring from the military, Arne served in a senior position for the OSCE in the non-government controlled area in eastern Donbas in Ukraine. They both join me today for an update on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Gentlemen, good to see you both again.
Hey, good to be here.
So maybe we can take a few minutes for a general roundup of where we are in this war. And Mike, maybe we can start with you for kind of a macro level of where we are at the moment, and then we'll go across to you, Arne.
Sure, yeah. So I think high level, we've seen an ever shrinking set of Russian objectives. We started out with nothing less than regime overthrow. Your listeners will remember the beginning stages of the war where they tried to make a dash for Kyiv and that didn't work. And actually they got routed north of Kyiv and left. And then they were going to look at taking the Black Sea coast, so the southern coast, so linking up this area where they've been since 2014 in the Donbas to Crimea and then maybe on to Transnistria. And then that got scaled back to just focusing on the Donbas, which is comprised of two regions, Luhansk and Donetsk, in the east. And actually, although their stated aim is still to take the whole of the Donbas, we've actually seen a further narrowing, really to just one or two axes. And so your listeners will have heard that, the news over the past 2 weeks is this city called Severodonetsk. It's the biggest population center in Luhansk. Important for symbolic reasons, actually more than military reasons. Actually, there's a riverbank behind it and a big hill and another city to the west in Ukrainian hands, which is much more defendable. But because it's this sort of, last big population center in Luhansk, which is half of the Donbas, which is obviously what the Russians would say is their objective, the Ukrainians have decided to make a stand there. And over the last couple of weeks, we've seen it go backwards and forwards, really. The control of it go backwards and forwards. The Russians have had to strip out forces from other fronts. There's probably kind of three areas of military activity around Kharkiv in the northeast. That's the second biggest city in Ukraine. In the Donbas and Severodonetsk, and in the south in Kherson. And they've had to strip forces out of the other two fronts to make progress in the Donbas. And finally, whilst the Russians have made some small amounts of progress in the east, because they've had to strip out forces elsewhere, particularly in the south, the Ukrainians have managed to push them back about 10k, which is about the same distance that the Russians have managed to move them in the east. And so it'd be interesting to see what happens over the next month or so, whether the Ukrainians will be able to take Kherson back, which is this city in the south that was really the only big city that the Russians have controlled since the beginning. And it was where they were going to have this big referendum and everyone's going to get annexed. They're all going to join Russia. And the reason for that is it's really important because it's the only place where the Russians have a foothold north of the Dnipro River. And this is this big river, most strategically important waterway in Ukraine, which runs from the south by Crimea all the way up to Kyiv, runs through Kyiv in the north. And if the Russians hold Kherson, it makes it much easier in either this conflict or a future conflict to take another chunk out of Ukraine. Whereas if the Ukrainians take it back, and as I said, they've had this counteroffensive over the last few weeks, then that makes their country much more defendable.
Yeah, the Russians lose the foothold. Arne, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, basically, I share the overview here that Mike gave us. I think it's important to emphasize that the Russian forces, I mean, they were spread from the Sea of Azov and up to Kiev along the border at the very beginning. But now, I mean, basically, what we see is fighting going on in something that's about the size of a stamp on an envelope. If you compare to the rest of Ukraine. And I know this area very well. I've been there for 3 years. And of course, the big advantage with Severodonetsk is it's really urban terrain. And walked around a lot there. So you can really get a lot of urban terrain where you can defend from. And of course, as Mike mentioned, you have this other city close by, Lysychansk, which is actually quite extraordinary, high level above Severodonetsk. So if they want to attack, the Russians attack from Severodonetsk and into Lysychansk if they take Severodonetsk, they will have to cross the river and then they will have to enter up a steep hill. So it's a defendable area in Severodonetsk. Also, I think very much I share the opinion that it's mostly for symbolic reasons that Severodonetsk is thought about nowadays. I admit I consider a few square kilometers more or less in Donbas. I don't see that of any military strategic importance. But what I've said several times lately, and Mike alluded to it, is that Kherson is actually the area to watch. And of course, if they lose the foothold east and north of the river, we also had the problem with the water intake into Crimea, which was closed for 8 years. And now the water is flowing again. And if they have this ambition to go to Transnistria, I mean, if they lose the foothold on the north and west of this big river, I mean, that will be immensely more complicated to establish a land corridor from Mykolaiv to Transnistria if they just have to give up Kherson. And of course, the other interesting part of Kherson and a couple of other places is that you still have a pretty huge Ukrainian population present. Otherwise, I mean, it's just a heap of rubbish around, basically. So there is no one there. At least not any significant number. But in Kherson, you still have a city that is actually up and running. And you also see that the first signs of an insurgency going on there and also in Melitopol. So it's, in my mind, probably more interesting to watch in the long and medium term than what's actually going on exactly on this small stamp around Severodonetsk in Luhansk.
Mikey, would you?
I'm sorry, Maz. I know it's your podcast, but actually, can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we can just cut
let me
Maz
just introduce my co-host, Mike Martin.
So, that's exactly it. It's a symbolic target in the east versus something of real military value in the south. And if you look at all of the media is focused on the east. So why is that, Arne? Like, what's going on?
Well, I guess the problem is that people don't listen to us.
Al Jazeera bookers, BBC bookers, we're available.
That's right. Yeah, there's a small fee involved, but reach out.
Honestly speaking, I think that it has to do with the fact that Putin on the 21st of February, he promised this whole Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, they should become so-called independent states, and all that. And I imagine that is probably the reason why Putin is pressing the offensive in this area.
Yeah.
Because he wants to say one day that, okay, I have, accomplished what I promised.
Yeah.
And now we are liberated, big quotation marks. So
it's actually a tactic we've seen from, and the Ukrainians are holding them there whilst they make gains elsewhere, which is a tactic that we've seen before. So they held the Russians in Mariupol. They tied down lots of combat units in Mariupol,
absolutely,
whilst they were doing things elsewhere in the country. And again, what we see here now is around Kharkiv and around Severodonetsk. We see them holding the Russians, attriting them, trading space for time, and attriting the Russian forces, whilst they're actually pushing in other areas. And it's also interesting because Zelensky is obviously in on the plan, obviously because he's the Ukrainian boss. But if you listen to all of his pronouncements in international media, he's talking about how Severodonetsk is the battle for the, he can't speak in grander terms about it. It's the battle for the heart of this is where it's going to be. This is the decisive point.
We will stand.
And and that's partly obviously to drag weapons out of the West, which have kind of slowed recently, and that's fair enough. But I think it's also partly to make everyone focus on it, whilst actually they make some really useful gains elsewhere.
Well, it's one of the principles of war, right? Deception, and I guess if that's what what they're doing. So what you're both suggesting, the Severodonetsk is merely a distraction, both geopolitically, whilst Kherson might be the real thing to look for.
Yeah, that's the most, in my mind, the most strategic area is Kherson right now. But I think the Ukrainians, as you alluded to, Mike, actually they have developed quite a shrewd strategy, because they have been delaying the Russian forces around Severodonetsk with maybe not more than a couple of brigades. The most, and even this pocket that you can see slowly being formed and taking place on the map over the last month. And you should remember that the Russians have been attacking Severodonetsk for a lot more than a month. I mean, the disastrous river crossing didn't count the first day, that happened on the 8th or 9th of May. So for more than a month.
Wow.
Then for more than a month, they hardly have had any progress in this area. We are talking about a few kilometers at the best. So, I'm pretty sure that this is what the Ukrainian want the Russian to do, and they can apply economy of force and hope for more Western weapons to arrive, and also trade. Get some more extra time to train up Ukrainian military personnel.
And as you said, the urban terrain favors a defender, right? So in open terrain, you need 3-1, let's say, if you're an attacker against a defender. In urban terrain, they can go up to 7-1 or 10-1, And the Russians are, we've sort of seen, I was just reading an article actually before we came on about the press ganging. So whilst Russia is not having a general mobilization within Russia, within those two, in Luhansk and the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which are these things that were created in 2014 that no one recognizes, they have had military law since the beginning of the conflict, and they have been conscripting people in. And there are stories of people being picked up off the street, made to sign papers, and then 3 days later, literally 3 days later, with no military training, they find themselves standing next to Russian soldiers in Severodonetsk. These are not the actions of an army that has their shit together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I guess that's the other question. We're seeing also figures about the casualties. Yes, on one side, we know that Ukrainians are. I think Zelensky made the point. Between 80 to 100, but there are reports of Russians losing about 300 per day. Firstly, how credible do you think those numbers are? And then secondly, how sustainable is this? Where do you keep drawing troops from? I think some of the figures was 32,000 soldiers or conscripts that Russia has lost. What impact is this having, and how sustainable is this type of aggression by Russia? Maybe either of you or both can answer.
Well, I mean, first of all, we should remember that Russia is basically fighting with a scaled-down peace establishment force, and they have not been able to expand the force very much, which means that every brigade will just have 2 battle groups available at the best, and even they are not manned up to what the numbers should be. Yeah. I mean, we all know that in general, the Russian units are pretty lean on infantry, and even if they are manned up to the peacetime establishment, so they are fighting with battalions that are probably half the size of what they should be. Yeah. Which means that if you hear that you have 3 or 4 battalion groups up against you, I mean, the number of people will be far less than the norm should be. So they're very short on trained and motivated personnel. What they're not short is artillery and ammunition. So I'm quite often joking in saying you should always remember that the Russian army is basically an artillery army with a few tanks and a few APVs.
I mean, yeah, Mike, sorry, jump in.
I was going to say, it's this, Arne's nailed it. Like, it's this idea of a balance. When we talk about combined arms forces, they need to be balanced, right? So, tanks, artillery and infantry each have weaknesses and strengths. And so they need to be, and they're the Russians are very infantry light. So this battalion tactical group of, say, 1,000 might only have 150 or 200 infantry. And that's why they came unstuck in the initial invasion, because they just got hammered with all the anti-tank weapons because they didn't have any infantry out screening ahead of their vehicles.
And supporting the close battle, of course. Yeah.
Right. And again, we look at several others. So you need infantry in urban warfare. You need infantry. That is, you need the other bits as well, but you absolutely essential is infantry. And if you're being shelled, it is possible. It's very uncomfortable. You can dig into the ground. You can survive artillery barrages. Not everyone's going to survive, but you can keep your force preserved if you've prepared defensive positions. And we saw this 100 years ago in the First World War, right? People would dig into trenches and they survived, and that hasn't changed. So again, you see these sort of interesting. And again, the Ukrainians are very infantry heavy, which enables them to defend very well, which we've seen consistently. But it makes it harder for them to go on the offensive, because for the offensive, you need maneuver, and to create maneuver, you need armored vehicles and tanks and all the rest of it. So we sort of see both of the armies, the way they're configured is creating what we see on the ground.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it that way. I mean, we're seeing the kind of 2 types of, they're both fighting a different type of war. And of course, that's having a massive impact. I do find it interesting, though, that Russia is so artillery heavy, which is why they're prepared to just have raw recruits come in and with a basic training. But that surely has to have an impact both on the capability of that armed force, but also on the unit cohesion. I mean, if you're forming units on the march, so to speak, surely that has to have an impact on how cohesive, how effective those combat units are. Never mind the morale of those troops if they're dying, 300. What impact is this having? I mean, how do you both see that, and particularly this kind of importance of morale?
I mean, I see this as like it's an ineffective force, like being under mortar fire.
And sorry, just the reason I'm asking this, is because we're hearing more and more that, have we underestimated Russian incompetence? Are the Russians, regrouping? Are we seeing them, better concentrate their force? Of course, we've seen the failures from the start of the war and the invasion. Are they now better at kind of concentrating their firepower, using, their limited forces in a better way?
Yeah, but I mean, okay, so there's lots of questions there. On your first question about forces that have just been conscripted, the reality is coming under fire for the first time is an experience, to put it mildly. Getting mortared for the first time, that's starting to get quite scary. And basically, if you've just got civilians and they're being mortared by the Ukrainians, to your point about cohesion and morale, which are, small unit cohesion and morale really are critical, fundamental underlays of fighting power, along with logistics. Those units are going to dissolve. People are going to run away. Like, it's not far for them to run away, right? They just need to get out of there. They probably need to, 100K and they're back home and they can go and hide out in their aunts until the whole thing's blown over. Right? Like, they speak the language. It's easy for them to get away. Like, what are the Russians going to shoot them in the back? I mean, they probably are, but it's not the Second World War. I can't remember I don't know what your second question was.
I mean, it was all kind of mixed into that. That was the primary one. I mean, I think that's the impact. So Arne, you go.
Well, I mean, obviously, what we have seen is a force of very, very low morale, and a lot of deserters have been seen around trying to get away from combat and all that. But again, just let me return to the fact that, I mean, there is some small incremental progress going on with the Russian forces in the area of Severodonetsk. But we should remember, as I mentioned earlier, that this fight has been ongoing since late April, early May. And they're talking about, at the best, a couple of kilometers across the center of Severodonetsk. And they have concentrated a lot of their forces there. They have thinned out in Kherson, as Mike mentioned, and also in other areas, and where they are basically now building fortified positions to defend, because they don't have any offensive capacity in those areas, because everything is concentrated in Donbas. And even with this absolute maximum concentration of forces and artillery, still they have hardly made any progress for more than a month. So even if they're making progress, I mean, it's so slow and so incremental, and they are really taking heavy casualties in this fight in the urban terrain of Severodonetsk. So this has been a disaster and no success story at all.
I'm just looking at some. The Institute for the Study of War every day publishes these maps of control, which I'm sure people on Twitter have seen. And they just collate reports and just sort of shade in the map, and it's quite interesting. So if you look around Popasna, which was where they started to kind of make this salient to try and cut around behind Severodonetsk, basically to create a pocket where the Russians are trying to create a pocket. The maximum extent of that advance is about 20 kilometers, and it's about 10 kilometers wide. So 20 kilometers advance on a kind of 10 kilometer wide salient. And then if you look down in the south, in Kherson, the width of the front that the Ukrainians have advanced on is about 100 kilometers. So it's 100 kilometers wide, and in some places it is 20 or 25 kilometers deep. In other places it's only sort of 10 kilometers deep, or it's 8 kilometers deep. So actually it's actually more territory. The Ukrainians have taken more territory of the Russians in the south than the Russians have taken. Than they've given up in the east.
Which is interesting. I mean, it seems to be the emotional attachment to I guess, Donetsk and Severodonetsk by the Russians might be the sword that they fall on, or at least that's what we're, I guess, in many ways hoping.
Obviously, the Russians are discussing these issues also quite a bit. I mean, a lot of the military bloggers have questioned the wisdom in thinning out in the area of South and Kherson, and then, move that much forces to the fight in Donbas. Because obviously, as we both have touched upon so far, there is no particular strategic military advantage if you have Severodonetsk or not, or if you have Kramatorsk or not. It's just a few more square kilometers.
So would Ukraine be prepared to trade the area permanently?
No, I don't think so. For the time being, we should also remember that almost all of what was the government-controlled area of Donetsk Oblast is still government-controlled area. The other progress they have made is basically in Luhansk and not in Donetsk Oblast. That has to do with the fact that they came in north of the line of contact. So they didn't have to breach the line of contact to get into Luhansk. They crossed the border between Russia and Ukraine. They didn't come through these entities that Putin created. So still most of Donetsk is on the government controlled area.
Right. So
this kind of like trading thing as well. There's so much chitter chatter, basically amongst heads of state who should know better. And, even people like Kissinger, I'm very surprised about. He's saying, well, we should have a deal here. You've got to trade, the Ukrainians have got to trade, whatever, Luhansk for, a peace deal or whatever. But I think, and, be realists, guys, is the kind of call, like, you're facing overwhelming force. Be real about this, but actually that's not the proper realist interpretation of what's going on. The realist interpretation of what's going on is if Russia is not put back in its box, then it will come and do this again. Yeah.
Well, we've seen it. We've done it. Georgia, the Crimea. I mean, this is time and time again.
Exactly. And the reason we're fighting this war is because we didn't put Russia back in its box after Georgia, after Crimea, after Syria, after Finland put Russia back in its box in 1941. There haven't been any problems from Russia for Finland. And I think that it's the same. And ultimately, from the Ukrainian strategic point of view, I think they have a trade. Either we're going to lose 100,000 civilians now or something fighting this war, civilians and military. But if we win, by win, I mean the regain control of their sovereign territory, then that will then you'll probably join the EU or whatever. They'll maybe get security guarantees. Maybe they'll join NATO. That then solidifies their country, and they're fine for the next generation or two. Yeah. Some kind of peace treaty can only ever be a frozen conflict, and it basically invites Putin or whoever's next to take another chunk out of land that. It can be spun in Russia that these are historical lands that have always been part of Russia and so on and so forth. So I think that is the realist appreciation of what the strategic situation is for Ukraine. And it's not nice, but strategy is not nice. It's real. And often I think we confuse what's humanitarian or what's going to save the most lives now with a kind of realist approach. But actually, that's not a realist approach, because you'll lose those lives. You might not lose them now, but you'll lose them the next time the Russians try and take a chunk out of some. And then some,
yeah. I mean, I guess which is why what question that I have for both of you is, what do you make of Macron's statements? To not humiliate Russia, because that's kind of the at least the French stance at the moment, for that very reason that there's a trade-off here of the potential risk. We need to stop this war because the risk of humiliating Russia is so great because it's a nuclear armed superpower, and that's kind of pushing against what you're saying there. It's kind of the counter realist threat of might is right. Putin might ultimately push the red button. What do you both make of that?
I'm not scared about the red button, to be honest. And I think it was pretty stupid what Macron said, because actually that makes us underestimate what France is actually doing, because France is giving a lot of support to Ukraine. So, but I mean, Macron has had these unfortunate comments before. When he traveled to see Putin at the end of the long table, before the war broke out, he came up with this word of Finlandization when he traveled back from Moscow. I mean, where did he pick that up from? And now he had this interview, and then he suddenly jumped up with this idea that Putin should not be humiliated, whatever that could possibly mean. It's difficult to imagine what it could mean or not mean, but it gives the impression that he's talking about some future Russia without taking into consideration what is actually going on in Europe. I mean, a large-scale war. And so he puts France in a difficult position. And I certainly agree, Mike, with your assessment of possible Russian behavior in the future. I don't think any kind of peace agreement signed with Russia is of any value whatsoever. I mean, why should Russia suddenly, at this time, for the first time in its 400-500 years of history, actually live up to something they signed on? There's no reason to believe that. Why should they exactly at this time start to keep what they have promised? I mean, they've signed gazillions of treaties, the UN Charter, all the treaties in the Helsinki process about the security architecture of Europe. They signed and guaranteed the Ukrainian territory in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. I mean, if Russia had just lived up to just one of the agreements they have signed, there wouldn't be any war. I mean, just one of them. I'm very sure that the Ukrainians understand that very well, and in their approach to what kind of treaty they could possibly imagine, you can easily see that they don't trust the Russians. And of course, I mean, who trusts the Russians? I mean, nobody.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, what are you seeing or hearing from inside Russia? I mean, because surely this has got to be raising some alarm bells with both the Russian people, but also the chain of command, the military chain of command. They've got to be cognizant of this. I mean, the war is not going well by any stretch of imagination, even though they're making some small progress. But how much longer can it take, and how much can the people take? I mean, are the sanctions having an impact? Are we seeing any change of narrative inside Russian borders?
So, who do you want us?
Yeah. I mean, both of you, but
yeah. Okay. Let's just jump back to May 9. About there was all kind of rumors what Putin would state or say he would do on the 9th of May for the anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. But basically, he came across at the end of the day with absolutely no ideas. He had absolutely no ideas, nothing that could have any kind of impact on the front line in Ukraine. And basically, nothing has happened in Russia in between. They are basically doing the same sluggish style of warfare that they did 1.5-2 months ago. I mean, there's no change to it. And for sure, if you look at all the desperate ways they try to recruit people, obviously the shortage of competent personnel is really bad to deal with. But I don't think Putin can actually mobilize, because up to now, basically the soldiers that have been dying, they are coming from the more poor districts in the east. You can also see on their face that they are not Russians,
non-ethnic Russians.
No ethnic Russians. But of course, if you mobilize, that means that the sons of the middle class around Leningrad and St. Petersburg and Moscow will also be involved in the war. And you have
was that a Freudian slip?
Yeah. and of course,
I thought we were back there. We're back a century.
back in the old days, and
it's kind of appropriate, yeah.
Absolutely. And you also get the problem with taking all those people out of the economy. Russia has never done that since the Second World War. So there are all kind of pitfalls around starting a mobilization. And also you can question if it's at all possible to train people that you mobilize. Because in the Russian army, you don't have training centers or huge training units as we have in the West. The soldiers train in the units where they are going to stay, and those units are already in Ukraine. So there is no possibility to train soldiers, and the instructors, well, they are the officers that are dying in Ukraine. So even if you mobilize, I mean, soldiers will just be hanging around and couldn't be taken care of. You can also question if they have enough reserve material to train them, because they're already sending T-62s to the front.
Yeah, there's something to be said about training on the battle. Yeah.
But they started with 200K, right? And if you assume in a mechanized army, I mean, I don't know, if it was the US Army, which is more technological, the tooth to tail ratio, so i.e. the ratio of fighting troops to the support troops, so logisticians, intelligence, meds, everything that's not kind of holding a bayonet, that might be 10 to 1 in the American Army. Let's say it's, even if we say it's 5 or 6 to 1, let's call it 5 to 1 to make the maths easy in the Russian army. So they started with 200. That means they only got 40,000 fighting troops, right? And then what was the casualty figure you came up with earlier? Well, that was 30,000. Yeah. So, and then it means they got 10,000 of their original troops left, and they're obviously spread out all around all the areas that they are, Kharkiv,
and are rapidly dying.
But then that's why you can see why they're press ganging teenagers in Donetsk and Luhansk, because they literally don't have anyone. They can't, though the infanteers are the ones that they can press gang off the street. Here's a rifle, get on with it. You can't press gang a doctor or an artilleryman or an intelligence specialist, right? Because they take time to train. So the ones that have the shortest training time are the ones that you press gang.
It's really interesting. I mean, what I'm hearing you both say is that this potentially could all unravel very, very quickly. So what does Ukraine need for this to occur? I mean, we mentioned before, or Mike, I think you made the point that, while Ukraine's been getting a lot of weapons, that's slowed down at the moment. Is Ukraine getting enough support? And if not, what does it need? I know, Arne, you've been quite vocal on some of your social media and even some of the kind of regular media commentary on this, but maybe start with Mike and then go across to you, Arne.
I mean, what I've noticed is that just look at it in PR terms first, rather than Zelensky seems to move from weapons category to weapons category. So we started out with anti-tank weapons, didn't we? And then it was kind of, I think there was vehicles for a bit, and then it was artillery, and now it's the latest one I heard today is air defense.
Yeah.
And I wonder if
2,600 and 4 reasons or something by the figures undoubtedly wrong, but that I'm misquoting him, but yeah. He never asks for like drones, which I would be asking for like thousands of tiny drones that you can the ones that have got explosives attached to them that you can fly over. They're basically little like suicide insects that you can drop on. So look, what do they need? I mean, I mean, artillery is one way. That's what they've been asking for a long time, is obviously a good way of doing counter battery fire. So if you're being fired at with artillery, you find out where they're firing. You use a computer basically and a radar to trace back the flight path of the shell that's coming towards you, so you can fire back at the thing. I mean, fair enough. The problem with artillery is it has an unbelievably huge logistics footprint. Yeah. So it's not just once you've got the guns, you can fire off a shipping container full of shells in a couple of hours, and then what? And so okay, that's what they're asking for. Means you've got to continually have shipping containers full of shells being driven across Ukraine. That's why I kind of wonder whether, and maybe they are being supplied these things, but no one's talking about it. But, small drones, and particularly as NATO really dominates the surveillance and, the electronic warfare and the signals intelligence space in Ukraine, I wonder whether there isn't actually a lot of small drones going across that are helping spot targets and queue assets onto, all that kind of stuff. But it's a cheap way to assist as well. I'm sure
it's a briefcase. It's a briefcase, and then it's once you've got it, it's good. That's it. Yeah. You doesn't need, you can charge it up off a USB.
Yeah.
You don't need shipping containers worth of,
Yeah. We've seen what the Bayraktars have done. Their shares have gone through the roof, undoubtedly. Arne, what do you think?
I pretty much agree with what Mike said about. I would have loved to have some more drones if I was a Ukrainian commander, because if you have the Switchblade 600, for example, just to use that one, I mean, you don't necessarily need artillery for counter battery fire. You can use a drone also. So there are many ways to do it. And what I hope they get is electronic warfare equipment that can block signals from the Russian guns and up to space. They do have their own GPS system. So blocking that could be very effective. And also, I tend to think that you just need to have a certain number of long-range artillery or rocket artillery for counter-battery fire before the Russians will have to behave in a much different way, tactically speaking. You don't actually need to fire at them. They will have to start to behave like they could be fired at, which means that when you position a gun, you cannot be there for a long time, which means that you cannot build up a lot of ammunition in one spot and plan on hanging around there firing for the rest of the day. You have to move shit all the time, both the gun and all the ammunition. And that by itself will lower the number of grenades that you can fire significantly. You really don't fire at them at all. You just have to make them behave like they will be fired at.
It hugely exposes the other Russian weakness. I was going to say hugely exposes the other Russian weakness, which is mobile logistics. As soon as you force them to deliver stuff along small roads, or if you're moving your gun posts all the time and you've got to move the ammunition with them, then their logistics has been rubbish. So it probably will seize up the entire artillery force. Especially when you got raw recruits picked up off the street who are now,
absolutely. I mean, I recall when I was 3 years in Luhansk and Donetsk, they usually filled up with, mine workers that had been working in the mines, and of course they were unemployed, so they were put to guard, so to speak, the line of contact. And of course it was well paid. I mean, they got 15,000 rubles a month, which is about twice of what a teacher would make in this area. But of course, as military personnel, they were completely useless and drunk most of the time, but they made good money.
Wow. We're talking about their military, right? Look, gentlemen, that all makes sense. Maybe you can just pivot now briefly, and conscious of our time, we'll try and keep this one relatively short. But one player that's really trying to, I guess, wedge himself in there is undoubtedly Erdogan. With Turkey, or Turkey, I should say, as it's been requested to now be known. What role is Turkey playing in this war, especially with the whole, managing of grain shipments in and out, and seeking some sort of resolution and negotiations between the two presidents, that being Zelensky and Putin? What are your thoughts? Maybe Mike first, and then Arne again.
Turkey, look at where Turkey is on a map, right? It's right in the middle of everything. The Middle East is in one direction, the Caucasus are in another, Europe's in another, the Balkans are there, Mediterranean, Africa is right, it's at the crossroads. And I think that geopolitical positioning affects the psychology of Turkish leaders. They're basically balancing. It makes Turkey a balancing power. It is always trying to the uncharitable way of looking at it is play off outside powers off against each other. The charitable way of looking at it is that's what their saleable commodity is, because they have links to everyone. They're actually able to trade information and ideas and so on and so forth. So what they're trying to get out of it, they're trying to, as usual, they're trying to get, as any country would, I should add, they are trying to get maximum advantage out of it. So, right at the beginning, they closed their airspace to Russia, or Russian troops reinforcing Syria. And obviously, Turkey and Russia have got, although despite the bonhomie, they have different strategic objectives in Turkey. So that was a kind of thanks very much, we'll have that. And then they've been selling loads of drones and making a load of money. They've also been trying to negotiate between the two sides as a kind of intermediary. They're blocking Finland and Sweden to joining NATO, but actually they won't. They'll just back down once they've got a pound of flesh.
So it's just a bargaining chip.
they closed the Bosphorus Straits to put pressure on Russia. But, it's just great. I mean, for them, it's brilliant. They can just sort of tinker with stuff to their advantage. And I don't think that they have they'd like to see Russia weakened, I think, long term, because Russia competes with them in the Caucasus, in the Middle East. But they can, along the way, they can kind of extract some pots of gold from various different people whilst they do it.
Arne?
I tend to think in much the same way. We should, of course, recall that Turkey is very dependent on gas coming from Russia. So that's a soft spot, of course. And also in Libya, they were fighting on supporting different warlords there. They have some issues going on in Syria. And of course, the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in the autumn of 2020, they supported, of course, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Russia to a certain degree, Armenia, but only to a certain degree. So of course, Turkey is basically in a very bad neighborhood compared to many of the NATO members. So I can see that they need to do a lot of balancing, and I agree with Mike. I don't see that they are going to block Finland and Sweden for forever. I still know quite a few people in NATO headquarters, and my feeling is that they are quite relaxed about that, actually. Sometimes this will be solved, seems to be what they are thinking. So, of course, Erdogan is playing a lot of this role because presidential election is coming up in about 1 year in Turkey. And I mean, we should
interest versus values, right? Always
we should never forget that. So it will be interesting to see how Turkey at the end of the day comes out of this. But I've served 6 years in top NATO positions, and I've been dealing a lot with Turkey. And normally there is some kind of bargain at the end of the rainbow.
Okay, well that's certainly reassuring and promising. Now, what about the dragon? We can't skip a discussion on how China is doing.
Wales.
People might not get that. You might have to explain that for our non-British audience.
So in British humour. Sorry, are all of your audience, are they Australians, are they?
Well, they're certainly not all British.
More's the pity.
Surprise.
4 nations that make up the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and the Welsh flag has a dragon on it.
Yeah.
So we talk about the Welsh dragon.
Yeah. No, I was talking about the slightly bigger one, China.
The slightly bigger one, yes.
Especially, I mean, I don't know if you've probably seen the news of Putin apparently using some expletives to describe Xi, calling him an asshole, I believe, which I thought was rather comical, I guess, when it comes to two world leaders. But what are you making of the China-Russia relationship, and how is China viewing this, particularly in relation to Taiwan? Arne, maybe start with you this time.
Yeah, and I can start out with a few reflections. I think, first of all, that this war has shown that China is only in a very transactional relationship with Russia. And obviously, China is basically not supporting Russia at all, because Russia is not a big trading partner for China. It's just a couple of % of China's trade is with Russia. It's about 10% with Germany, and of course the most important one is the US. So Russia is not important in that aspect. So and of course it has made life much more difficult for China, particularly in relation to Europe, because China was hoping that they could have a normal, so to speak, business relationship with Europe. And now this is unraveling because first, of course, all the human rights abuses inside China itself. But of course, the problem is if they are supporting Russia in this war, this will definitely unravel completely between China and Europe. So they are in a difficult position. But for sure, I don't think the Chinese president is the kind of personality that one will say openly, "Oh shit, I was wrong. I supported Russia. I should have done different." That's not. That's for sure. So, and also, I don't believe in this theory that we can do Nixon Kissinger 2-0 over again, because it was a strike of genius in 1972 when they opened up to China. But we should remember that during the Cold War, China and the Soviet Union, they were opponents about what the right religion, so to speak, was, the Marxist-Leninists and all that. And they fought a war in 1969 up in Manchuria. So one of the biggest diplomatic successes, I would say, for both Russia and for China is this new relationship between the two of them, because this has led to the obvious advantage for Russia. They don't need to keep that much forces on the Chinese border as they used to do. And China is not keeping that much army forces along the border to Russia anymore, which means they can concentrate down in the direction of the ocean, which, of course, is so much greater importance to China. I would say that this war in Ukraine, it should have reminded Beijing about the unpredictability of war. So I tend to think that Taiwan is somewhat safer than it was before this started.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think the Americans have realized that, one way of viewing the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is a failure of Western deterrence. And deterrence gets more expensive the later you leave it, and now it's costing us an absolute fortune, and it's destroying Ukraine. And we saw recently when Biden met the Quad. So right after your election, your new Prime Minister, Albanese, one of his first actions, right, was to go
the first day,
and meet up with the Quad. So the Quad is India, America, Japan, and Australia. And it's basically a containing China security alliance. Let's be frank about it. And Biden said in that meeting that the US would intervene militarily to defend Taiwan explicitly.
Yes.
And previously there has been some strategic ambiguity deliberately maintained, but hinting that there would be some American response and so on and so forth. But actually America has now come out and said that, which, if you think about what they were doing before the Ukraine war, they were saying, we definitely won't get involved militarily, but there will be some other consequences. Talk about a green light. And so I think the Americans have learned that, and that has changed. And if you think the Russian army is having a problem, well, the Chinese army hasn't fought a war for a long time. Okay, it hasn't fought a war for a long time. It suffers from many of the same structural problems that the Russian army does, in the sense that there's a yes man culture. Right? Problems are not rooted out. Truth is not told to power in that system. And when you have systems that are like that are corrupt, it's hard to get people to charge machine gun posts because they don't feel that there's trust in that army. And, just look at the military difficulty. Russia is invading a country that is next door, it shares a long border with, and it can choose where to cross that border and drive its vehicles across. There's lots of similarities of language and all the rest of it. China and Taiwan, there's a similarity of language, but there's a sort of 100-mile sea crossing. Like amphibious landings are difficult. They're really difficult, particularly if they're contested. And how difficult would it be to contest that with submarines? Not very difficult. How difficult would it be to contest that with missiles? Not very difficult. And I just think that it's really, really, really made America's response, but also how difficult it's been for Russia, has made China look at Taiwan and go, we've got problems now, because we've based a lot of our political rhetoric on retaking Taiwan, but that's now looking really, really, really difficult. So I think a really interesting question is, over the next 6 months or year or whatever, I mean, they're having problems with the economy, aren't they? Problems with zero COVID. But at some point, the Chinese political system will have to grapple with this idea that they told everyone they're going to go for Taiwan, and now it basically means it's basically off limits because the Americans have drawn a red line. It's off limits without a major war, which the Chinese don't want.
Yeah, it's in
right?
no one's interest,
One child policy means that there's lots of families with one son. Okay, they do not want a war with lots of casualties. And so how does their political system digest that reality and come up with a new narrative? I think that's a very interesting question for the next kind of 12 to 24 months in China.
Yeah, wonderfully insightful. Last question for both of you then. What do you consider Putin's most likely, as well as the most dangerous course of action from here on in?
Well,
one each.
Yeah.
From here, I would say that for a long time, I believe that he has now settled for occupying, at least temporarily, the areas where Russian forces basically are in control as we speak. I say basic because it's not all complete control, and the front line from Kharkov to Kherson is about 1,000 kilometers, and it's thinly defended in many places. But in this area is also not bigger than they could probably keep it occupied also without any kind of agreement, any kind of peace agreement or whatever. And I have a hard time actually to see that this will end up with any kind of signed peace agreement, in particular because of the Russian war crimes and the genocidal behavior of the Russian armed forces. Obviously, the question has been raised is it ethically acceptable to give up land and people, Ukrainian people, to Russian military? They are just killing civilians and torturing civilians and so on. So I don't really see that Ukraine will accept that. And Ukraine has been very specific that they are not going to give up any territory. Of course, they will have to accept the military fact on the ground that more will be occupied than it was before the 24th of February. But to give any kind of recognition to Russia occupying this by signing an agreement, I really don't see that is going to happen.
Yeah. Mike?
Most likely, I think, is that because Putin has kind of framed the objectives around Donbas and whatever, we're going to see him sticking to that because he's surrounded with a kind of culture of yes men. It's not clear whether bad news is reaching him. So I think it's possible that we might see a further diminution of Russian objectives and focusing on kind of trying to desperately make progress in Luhansk and Donetsk. Most dangerous. I mean, I think the most dangerous is either one or two things, isn't it? It's either the kind of he loses his marbles and goes nuclear, which I agree with. I don't know. I just think that's very unlikely. I think he grew up in the Cold War and the rules of the Cold War where you don't lose nukes. And even when, in Afghanistan, the Americans supplied millions of dollars worth of equipment to defeat the Soviets, and in Vietnam and Korea, the opposite happened. There were lots of proxy wars that just went nowhere near nuclear. So I think that's very unlikely, although it is obviously the most dangerous. I think the other most dangerous is if we see a kind of collapse in Russia or the armed forces collapse, or there's some kind of coup against Putin. Russian leaders don't do very well when they lose wars. How that play, the West has got no idea how to handle that and how to secure, obviously, things like nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. That's very difficult. But what does it like, how do we shape that? What does that look like? I don't think anyone has a clue. And how do we not, part of the reason we are where we are is because of the mistakes of the 1990s. The West just kind of, part of that gangster capitalism that Putin then harnessed for his own good, but also trod on, he's very cleverly harnessed that gangster capitalism. And that was unleashed largely because of what the West did in terms of its structural programs and stuff. So how we fail, we've got to not make the same mistakes again. Like, it would be really good if Russia was a European power. That would be amazing. That should be the strategic goal of the West. So
which is a post. But it's a post-Putin world, obviously, because certainly Putin won't be part of the Europe that you envisage. So this is, and I guess that's the most dangerous part, is that the destabilizing effect of a collapsed Russia. Is that what you mean? And what happens to the weapons and the nukes? Is that what you mean as the most dangerous?
I think if it collapses and then the nukes get, who controls them? Where do they go? Like that, okay. It's that kind of whatever. Any number of films have gone into that scenario, right? Who controls them? I mean, there was when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a huge effort, wasn't there, to track them? Like, Ukraine had some of the stockpile when the Soviet Union fell apart, and they gave it up in return for security guarantees. I mean, they regret that. So it's not, if Russia if we don't have one governing authority in Russia who ends up controlling random nukes in the middle of Siberia, do they sell them to who do they sell them to? I don't know.
Arne, any final comments from you?
Actually, I consider a breakdown of the regime in Russia as possible. If you look at Russian history, I mean, it's nothing new about that. If you go back to 1600, which is, of course, quite a few years ago, but anyway, I mean, about 20 years at the beginning of 1600, Russia was basically without any kind of functioning government or regime. We should also remember in more recent times, if you go back to 1917, the Russian regime collapsed as part of World War I. And also the Russian Soviet regime collapsed again in 1990. So Russia actually has a history of regime collapsing. It's the only great power that has collapsed twice in the previous century. So obviously, it's not vaccinated against collapsing. That could happen again. So I agree. I mean, that's a danger that has to be taken into consideration. Like it's right, that what happens if it all collapses again?
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, listening to what you both have said over the past hour, it kind of seems like the most likely scenario also in many ways. I mean, if the Russian military has to culminate at some point, especially given what you've discussed of their weaknesses, especially if the Western support continues for Ukraine and Ukraine gains more and more weapons and sustains the fight. Of course, they've got morale and purpose on their side. They're fighting for their lives, for their families. The Russian conscripts are certainly not. And of course, Putin will keep pushing because he has to have some victory because, probably for his own ego, but also for his own political survival, he has to have a victory. So there has to be something that he comes back home with. And if that victory is not secured, then of course his position is destabilized more and more. And, sanctions have to have their effect at some point, although we are seeing, Russia still maintaining the supply of gas, etc. So still has revenue coming through. But gentlemen, unless there's any final points from both of you, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been a very insightful conversation. I knew it would be, putting the two of you together. So thank you very much for your time this morning. For me, I'm going to go have my first morning coffee. And I think for you both gentlemen, it's dinner time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having us. Enjoyed immensely meeting both of you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.